There's a phrase that goes around a lot and often in different kinds of contexts that goes something along the lines of stay in your lane. Obviously, we're referring to driving when we say you better stay in your lane. Perhaps you've heard that on the road, hopefully not on the road, but maybe you've heard that line on the road. Maybe you've heard it at your job. Maybe you've heard it from your own family, hopefully not too often. But it's often appropriate to hear the phrase stay in your lane. Especially when you're in a situation where you are insistent on doing something that you shouldn't be doing and is either out of your depth or out of your permission or responsibility, or simply something you're not cut out to do, right? The idea of staying in your lane is that, you have a certain area where you need to work and you shouldn't be leaving that area. And there's a lot of times where insisting that someone stays in their lane is appropriate. And certainly when they have a cobbled up idea of what they are called or equipped to do, or even stop caring about what they are called or equipped to do. And the Bible is certainly full of incidents where people are called to stay in their lane, and God insists that they stay in a certain lane. You have plenty of your Nadab and Abihu, strange fire kind of incidents. And there's plenty of examples of those in the Bible. However, the phrase stay in your lane, and I'm just going to stay in my lane and keep to my own job, can be counterproductive when it's used as an excuse not to grow. And specifically, as we are exploring this theme of growth and centered around growth this month, it's something I want to look at because there's also plenty of biblical examples of people who used the idea of staying in your lane as an excuse not to grow. You have examples of people like Gideon or Moses or Esther who God intentionally beckoned out of a lane that they felt like they belonged in into somewhere that was very frightening and scary, and called them into an area where they felt like they were completely unequipped, and even said as much and certainly had a right to feel as much. But God calling people in the Bible out of their lane. And obviously people like Moses or Esther are some of the big examples we have, and there's a lot of political intrigue that surround those accounts, and people have made movies about those sorts of things that are very inspirational. And so we have a lot of big examples of that, but there's also a lot of subtle ways where we see God doing this to his people, beckoning them out of an area where they think they ought to be staying. And one of those is in here in Nehemiah chapter 3. It's a very interesting passage to me. The context here is that Nehemiah has, through the hand of God, been given permission by the Persian king to go and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. And at this point, he has made it obvious what his plans are and rounded up everybody to work on different sections of the wall. And when you look at Nehemiah chapter 3, the whole chapter is really just a list of people who worked on the wall, sometimes something small about that person that we know, maybe their occupation, and a section of the wall that they worked on. Just to be totally transparent, I'm not super good at really interpreting a lot of the lists in the Bible. When you hear a lot of statistics about, the different people who are in a certain area or all the materials that were used on a certain building. But this list stuck out to me because it gives us a bit of a picture of the crowd that Nehemiah is working with when he's rebuilding this wall. And it's an interesting mix of people. In verse 1, you get Eliashib, the high priest, so you get the highest religious office in the city, is working on a section of the wall. In verse 16, you see that Nehemiah himself, who was a former wine bearer, now turned governor, is working on his own section of the wall. By the time you get to the end of the chapter, in verse 32, you get mentions of goldsmiths and merchants who are working on a section of the wall. There's several guys who are working on a part of the wall that's directly outside of their own house. What you don't see is a whole list full of only stonemasons and bricklayers building this wall. In fact, you get this one guy who's my personal favorite on the list, who's in verse 8. Halfway through the verse 8, you get this mention of a goldsmith who's working on the wall. And then you get also next to him, Hananiah, one of the perfumers, made repairs and fortified Jerusalem as far as the broad wall. Think about that. You're building a military-grade, structurally sound wall, and one of the guys on your list to be in charge of a section of it is a perfumer. That's not something you would usually expect, and not something that would be considered to be in a perfumer's lane, so to speak. And yet, here Hananiah, the perfumer, is building a pretty critical wall to the safety of the people of Israel. And in doing so, he's acting on the faith, just as everyone else here is in this construction project. They're acting on the faith that God can use them, no matter what their current skill sets are, to figure out how to build this wall and build it right as they go. And what we see, whether it's here or in some of the bigger accounts in the Bible, is that part of what makes growth as a Christian and as a believer kind of difficult is that it requires us to step into territory that we don't feel like is really in our lane and that we don't necessarily know. And it requires us to kind of put our foot in an area, maybe both feet in an area where we feel stupid and we feel inadequate and we feel overwhelmed and we feel scared, and maybe rightfully so. But when you look at God's message that he calls us to over and over throughout the Bible, you can see that he's really calling us to be perfumers who are willing to build walls. Because it turns out the lane that we think is ours really isn't ours at all. In fact, it doesn't even belong to us at all. And if you turn to Ephesians 2, Paul makes a very good construction analogy to illustrate this point about the project that we are a part of and the construction project we are a part of now. Ephesians chapter 2, starting in verse 17. And he, that is Jesus, came and preached peace to you who were afar off, and to those who were near. For through him we have both access by one Spirit to the Father. Now therefore you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom the whole building, being fitted together, grows into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you are also being built together for a dwelling place of God in the Spirit. Much like the people of Israel in Nehemiah's day, what we grow and build now is out of our depth, and perhaps maybe even it feels out of our lane. But what we build now is actually better. It's more than a defensive wall to rebuild a city. It is a temple in which Christ is the cornerstone. And if we are growing and working on it and building ourselves up with it, then that means God is willing to push us to be perfumers who are willing to lay blocks. He is calling us to be the liars and the cheats and the people who are bitter and lazy and narcissistic and inept and inadequate, to learn how to build a holy temple as we go on the job, whether we feel like we are ready for that or not. This is a section of our time tonight where we typically lay it out as an invitation to come to Christ. And something you often hear, and something that is often felt, I know I felt it, about a hesitation to step toward Christ is feeling like, well, that you're just not ready yet. Or maybe even feeling like you're not quite adequate yet. Maybe you have to get to a certain level of being less broken. Maybe you have to get to a certain level of being just a little bit more knowledgeable. Maybe you have to get to a certain level of feeling like you have things a little bit together. Because if you're going to walk into a church, after all, you have to have a certain amount together, right? And of course, what God says is that whether you feel ready or not, he is calling you in the state you are currently in. Because we are perfumers who build walls, whether we feel like we know how to build the wall yet or not. Because the reality is, and Christ knew this is why he came, none of us are ready to face God. None of us are ready to serve God in the way they are, but luckily for us, Christ is. And Christ has laid the cornerstone of the building that we all currently work on. And it turns out our work is a whole lot bigger than us. It's all wrapped up in him and his work. And so this is a time we've set aside to simply be an invitation. If you are someone who knows either that you need to come to Christ, whether you feel like you're adequate or not, or you feel like you need to finally get back to growing in your walk with Christ in a way that you've been neglecting for a while, this is your simple invitation to step into an aisle and make your way to the front as we stand and as we sing.